As Uncle Ben once said, with great power comes great responsibility. And to me, that's what Still Wakes the Deep is all about. Coming from Chinese Room and Secret Level, Still Wakes is a narrative cosmic horror game set on an oil rig. With a brisk runtime, for me, of about 4-ish hours, you'd think there wasn't much substance here, but with dense environments and narrative beats, the full story is delivered at a quick time for $34.99 US without going off of the rails. Now, speaking of the price though, you can also play the game on Game Pass, which is where I did play it, and in short, I loved my time with The Deep. However, it wasn't always the case. The opening had a scene with some wonky physics, and a lot of the hanging wires within the game tend to run at a lower FPS than the actual game itself, leading to some bizarre visuals that can take you out of the immersion. However, those issues did pass, but the one that did still stick with me, as I mentioned, I played on PC Game Pass. There is currently no version of DLSS, FSR, or XLSS support within that version of the game. Although it does say it within the settings, you cannot choose them. So if you want those full options at your disposal on PC, well, first off, you'll have to have an NVIDIA graphics card for the one, but otherwise, I would play it on PC. Or at the very least, wait for a patch. And I'll be honest, whether it was in bad faith or not, I left my first sitting with the game a little cold on it. However, I had been hyped for a while and I was intrigued to see where things would go next, as I kind of stopped essentially where things were just starting to escalate, although they hadn't really gripped me yet. And I'm so glad that I did continue, because not only did The Deep win back my favor, but he cemented himself as a character that has I'm just kidding. But it cemented itself in the upper echelon of horror experience in my eyes. Now that's a weighty thing to say, I know, so let's break it down. You play as Cameron McCleary, or Kaz as you're going to be called throughout the course of the game, who is the new guy on the oil rig, as he's enlisted to work out there for months, to basically avoid police after he got in some trouble on the mainland. And as he waits for his 5 stars to go back down, you'll get a really moody introduction to a still operational Barra D oil rig, meeting so many people that you can't keep up, and unless you're a rig worker yourself, seeing environments you also can't quite navigate easily. Which actually works out really well if you think about it, because you don't really know your way around, and neither does Kaz, not truly anyway. So in that way, you're kind of also in the eyes of the protagonist there as well. But it is a horror game, and one with a brilliant setting at that. So things have to go wrong, and they do. So much so that you've even got great anti-capitalist and corporate undertones. Thanks, Alien. And while Aliens, the sequel, is my favorite movie of all time, so I see it pretty much everywhere I look, Still Wakes the Deep reminds me of the first movie Alien, as well as The Thing if they had a baby. An isolated, claustrophobic ship where there's no chance of escape, along with really great body and cosmic horror. Speaking from a narrative standpoint, I think the game almost nails it. Incredible voice acting and animated characters shore up some of the most impactful moments of the story, and when Kaz is left to his own devices, the environments speak really well for themselves. With some few flashbacks, the game manages to tell a tight-knit story in a short runtime, while also allowing the player to feel fear, sadness, and hope, along with pretty much everything else in between. The pacing feels nothing short of perfect for what it is intended. However, as I said, I think the game almost nails the story. I would have loved just a little bit more notes to find throughout the world, and even if these were just for the sake of world building and filling out a little more of some of these characters we're meeting, I think the game feels pretty lean in this regard. And I know notes in a horror game aren't everybody's favorite thing, but it felt really bizarre not seeing as many here. And that, in and of itself, me saying that should be a testament to how streamlined this main narrative is. There's not a lot of side places to go, very little exploration, you're on a set path, but at the same time it's so highly curated that it does feel great. Ultimately though, I'm glad the game sticks to its main narrative theme. As I said, it's all about responsibility. Whether that's Kaz being responsible for his troublesome actions, or something greater, who's to say, but spoilers. But when looking at every aspect of the story, that's what the game is about. To not run away from your purpose. And that's something that a lot of the characters within this game have to come to grips with, but of course primarily that's going to show through our main character Kaz. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about presentation and how I think it feeds into both the story as well as the gameplay alike. Firstly, there's a lot of foreshadowing and hints at certain outcomes when you look around. Finding dead bodies is never a good sign, but about half or 2/3 of the way through the game, there's a major clue that indicates how the game will end, and while I did see it coming, the clues along the way felt very rewarding. And once again, that creates the idea to me that this was always Kaz's purpose. So, visually, Still Wakes the Deep looks great. Just make sure you turn off that film grain. Whether it's the particle effects of electricity, fire, smoke, or even the dense fog, there's a clear attention to detail in every shot. The same goes for the granular details on each environment. Some of these rooms or spaces you only ever go through once. Others you'll return to later to find that they are completely wrecked or altered in some major way. In terms of level crafting, the game swings for the fences, and due to the fact that each one of these variations or individual rooms looks amazing, I think it hits that mark. I know some roll their eyes at this too, but even the guiding yellow paint is done well enough to blend in at certain times. Whether it be the actual metal aspects of the oil rig, sometimes that's painted yellow. I think sometimes it works really well, but then there's other times where it's like, okay, there's quite literally some paint here. And I know a lot of people are getting fed up with yellow paint guiding people around, and that's where I have to ask, why so much yellow paint for a strictly linear experience? Was focus testing failing that much that each step forward must be hinted towards? In high-stress situations like chase sequences, I do believe it helps tremendously, but in moments of calm, I should say, in quotations, I could have done with a bit less guidance. Maybe it would have at least given the idea that I didn't know exactly what I was doing at all times. But at the end of the day, I gotta say, I think Outlast did it best where they said follow the blood, and it made perfect sense within the story and the gameplay. Now, because these areas are so linear though, every small moment feels like it was touched by dozens of artists to look and feel its absolute best. Even having the pacing just right for the gameplay works because if the game was any longer, I feel that it would have needed to add more gameplay elements, or for instance more chase sequences, or at the very least stealth segments. Also, because the game is so straightforward, in the very few moments that you may get caught, the checkpoints are also very fair, and they tend to let you keep the story going without any major headaches. And while there is still so much more to talk about visually that I love, a lot more of that would lead on the side of spoilers. Enemy designs are creepy and varied enough. The body horror really strikes as proportions of the human body contort on the victims and work their way throughout the oil rig itself. By the end, I was actually somewhat surprised Kaz didn't suffer more. Once again, more like Miles from Outlast, I was expecting a little bit of mutilation, but you don't really get that here. I guess minor spoilers for that. But the only other thing I'm going to say, strictly visually speaking, is this. I think this game nails cosmic horror in such a unique way. Obviously, cosmic horror has such a wide umbrella of different things, but it's delivered through that vessel of body horror that I already mentioned. While I don't want to show all of these environments, it's bound to pop up at some point throughout my videos here. There's plenty of growths around the oil rig that incorporate human bodies within them. And as you get further into the game, you're going to see more of the origins of some of these growth points and different things like that. And it's genuinely astounding how beautiful some of these places can look and how much you just want to touch them because you don't understand, but you know that within the game's world, that would probably mean your death. And to me, that great wondering of the unknown and that fear of, what could be around the corner next? What's the next form? That to me is that perfect cosmic horror to me. Now, visuals are only one part of the puzzle when it comes to the atmosphere, which is where I think this game truly nails its delivery, especially in scenes like this here. So clearly, the sound design is off the charts. The creature's moans in the unseen space on the deck is nothing short of captivating and eerie. And there's at certain points you can't tell the difference between the wind blowing from the oncoming storm and the actual creature itself calling out in potentially pain. And it's in that way that it reminds me of Amnesia the Bunker, a game that came out, I think a couple years ago now, where they talk about how some of the actual soundtrack or sound effects they use within the game are just, you can't really notice them individually, but high-pitched sounds that are meant to raise your heart rate. And that's what I feel a lot of this game was intended to do from a sound standpoint as well, even if maybe they weren't using that specific technique. There are other times that the sound effects from the creatures were unsettling and impressed me as well. Specifically, the way they pull themselves around with their tentacles, and you can kind of hear very like how they're grabbing for surfaces and try to reach their way to pull forward. It's very grounding and realistic in that sense, and in that way, it's one of the best cases for immersion that could be made. Now, outside of the creatures themselves, you've got these sound effects within the world. You've got twisting metal, rushing water, plenty of alarms that are going off throughout the game, and that in and of itself could have been a perfect symphony to be afraid of. However, Jason Graves did the soundtrack for this game. My most notable game that I know him from is Until Dawn, and I have to say he knocked it out of the park with this game. In my eyes, there's 2 or 3 major moments throughout the course of this game that hit emotionally, and those moments, along with many other moments for different reasons, are all perfectly supported by the soundtrack for the game. And while I haven't specifically talked about this yet, and I will in just a moment when I get to the voices, this game is very Scottish by design, and a lot of the sounds that come from this sound like it could be of that nature as well. Like the music, like this is some kind of folklore story that they're going to tell their kids about for generations to come, accompanied by some nice, national music. And really, there's nothing else to say. The music to this game is nothing short of great, and I think I might actually put this music into the rotation of songs that I put in videos when I can. Now, it goes without saying the voice performances within the game are great. There were times where I was like, okay, this is fine. They're doing their Scottish slang, their accents, or, natural dialect, if that's who the actors are, I'm not sure. But it wasn't until those few emotional moments, starting about the midway point through the game, that I really started to notice just how great, specifically Kaz and his best buddy Roy, really are throughout the course of the game. There's a few other characters that I really don't want to spoil the nature of their presence throughout the game, but everyone does a good job. It's just there's definitely those standouts that the more you get runtime with them, the more you're attached to those voices. And while that's the main point of the quality bar I want to talk on, one thing I thought was a really interesting little note was that sometimes the English subtitles for the game don't line up with what the characters are actually saying. So when Kaz says he's good with the Lecky, he's talking that he's good with the electric, and he might be able to help fix the lights or something like that. And it's in those kind of ways that the actual subtitles for the game kind of become like a pseudo-urban dictionary for Scottish people. And in that way, it's really cool. I tend to find myself glancing down to subtitles a little more than I would like to, but hey, they're there for a reason. And it's made even more hilarious by the fact that there is an achievement for the game playing it with the full Gaelic dialogue. So I'm actually curious to try that out at some point, but I'm going to let the game sit for a little bit before I play it again. Maybe get a little bit of that fear factor back in rather than that familiarity that I already know. But really, that's about everything I'm going to say about Still Wakes the Deep. I think it's an incredible game. I think for $34.99, some people are going to scoff at that 4 to maybe 5 or 6 hour runtime if you want to be a completionist. But I promise you this is an experience worth having. So at the very least, if you can play it on Game Pass, I recommend it. And I personally am going to go buy the game on Steam now. That way I can play it again with that DLSS and different things like that. And not to mention, I want to support the developers. I'm really curious to see what they do next after this. This is like a full-blown foray into horror after like Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs, and things like that. And I just love supporting high-quality horror. And if you do, I would consider doing the same. So thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know what you thought of the game down below, and I really liked it. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.